Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the roaring, frostbitten world of the Vikings, not the horned helmet cartoon version, but the real people who carved out lives on the edge of the known world. Through winters so brutal, even their axes froze solid in their hands. Before we dive in, hit that like button, and subscribe only if you actually enjoy this kind of deep, gritty storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and how cold it is where you are. Trust me, after this episode, even a 40-degree day will feel downright tropical. Now, dim the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, or better yet, a bearskin, and let's travel to the frozen fjords and icy forests of Scandinavia. Viking winter wasn't just a season, it was a siege. Snow-buried longhouses, ice sealed off trade routes, and the sun sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving people to huddle together in flickering firelight, listening to the wind scream across the North Atlantic. But they didn't just survive, they thrived. They braved blizzards in open longships, chopped wood with frozen fingers, insulated their homes with mud, moss, and livestock, and turned feast and fire into sacred survival rituals. Their stories, their strategies, and their superstitions weren't just about weather, they were about enduring the God's own test. So, sharpen your sea axe, keep your mug of mead close, and get ready. Because tonight, we're unraveling the bone-chilling truth of how the Vikings survived the darkest, coldest months of the year and what we can still learn from them. Absolutely, here's the full chapter, at least 2, 0 words, titled Longhouse or Icebox: How Viking Homes Battled Back the Cold. Imagine being trapped in a wooden box with your entire extended family, a couple of goats, and the overwhelming scent of pickled fish, damp wool, and smoldering peat moss. Now imagine this box is half buried in snow, buffeted by icy winds, and lit only by the orange flicker of a fire that mostly burns your eyes rather than warms your toes. Congratulations, you've just entered a Viking longhouse in the dead of winter. Welcome to the Norse version of central heating. Let's not pretend Viking homes were some cozy Scandi design fantasy with birchwood shelves and decorative elk motifs. These were not minimalist retreats for sipping oat milk lattes. Viking homes were smoke-filled, mud-walled endurance chambers, designed by people who looked at snow, shrugged, and said, "We'll just build around it." The classic Viking longhouse was essentially a timber rectangle with a thatched roof, low enough to trap heat, but high enough to hang meat. There were no chimneys, because why let smoke out when you can breathe it in? Instead, the smoke wafted freely around the single-room structure, fumigating fleas, blackening rafters, and giving every Norse child a lifelong cough and a scent profile best described as lightly roasted warrior. These homes were engineered for one goal: survive the winter without freezing solid or strangling your cousins. And if you think that sounds extreme, remember, in Viking Scandinavia, freezing to death wasn't just a cautionary tale, was a routine inconvenience. The architecture, if we can call it that without offending actual architects, was not about beauty, it was about blunt force survival. The walls of a Viking longhouse weren't elegant stone or polished wood, they were typically made of wattle and daub, a combination of woven sticks smeared with a thick paste of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung, when your insulation options are limited to what you can harvest from your backyard or scrape from a barn floor, you get creative. And nothing says, "We're beating winter," like plastering your walls with the byproducts of yesterday's breakfast. And yet, in a strange and earthy way, it worked. Wattle and daub offered decent insulation for the time, trapping warmth in and cold out, at least until a particularly spirited snowstorm decided to redecorate the landscape. In particularly frigid areas, Vikings went one better. They half-buried their homes into the ground, letting the earth itself serve as insulation. You want geothermal heating? The Vikings were doing it before it was cool, mostly because everything was frozen anyway. Let's talk about roofs. The Viking answer to both shelter and spontaneous indoor waterfalls. Thatched roofs made of straw or reeds were common, but they weren't exactly waterproof. After a few months of sleet, snow, and general atmospheric hostility, the thatch would sag, mold, and start dripping cold misery on anyone unfortunate enough to sleep near the perimeter. Still, they were cheap, easy to patch, and provided excellent insulation, assuming the neighborhood birds didn't steal pieces of it for their own nests. Roofs also had another feature. They held in smoke. Remember, no chimneys. Fires were built directly on the stone hearths in the center of the room, and the smoke simply accumulated. In theory, it would drift through gaps in the roof, but that process was slow, inefficient, and deeply unpleasant for anyone under 6 feet tall. On the upside, constant smoke did a great job preserving meat. On the downside, it preserved your lungs too just, in a less life-affirming way. Inside the longhouse, the layout was Spartan by necessity and democratic by design. Everyone slept, ate, and argued in the same open space. Privacy was a mythical concept, like dragons or warm feet. Benches and low wooden platforms ran along the walls, doubling as beds and seating. If you were lucky, you got a bed frame stuffed with straw. If you were unlucky, you got straw on the floor. If you were a goat, congratulations, you were probably sleeping in the warmest corner. It's worth pausing here to appreciate that the Viking longhouse was not just a home. It was a multi-species, multi-generational, smoke-filled commune. You lived with your parents, your children, your livestock, and probably your neighbor's cousin Olaf, who just needed a place to stay through winter. Vikings brought their animals inside, not because they were sentimental, but because they were practical. A cow generates about the same amount of heat as a small fireplace. Pigs and chickens, mobile radiators with unfortunate hygiene. The downside, of course, was the smell. But when the wind is howling and your beard is frozen to your chest, you'll take warmth over fragrance every time. Vikings didn't have glass windows. They had holes. If they were feeling fancy, they'd cover these holes with stretched animal bladders or oiled hydrocele attempts at double glazing. If double glazing involved the scent of goat urine and the opacity of a foggy lens. Most homes had shutters, but once those were closed for winter, you were sealed inside with smoke, animals, people, and your own sense of slowly diminishing dignity. Let's address heating, since that's what this whole chapter is really about. A Viking longhouse heated itself in 3 key ways: body heat, fire, and desperation. The hearth was the center of the home, the literal and spiritual heart of the household. It provided heat, light, cooking, and smoke-induced hallucinations. Fires were fed with whatever fuel was available: wood if you were lucky, peat if you weren't, and dried animal dung if things were getting a little too Oregon Trail. Fire wasn't just important, it was sacred. Letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Restarting a fire in winter wasn't as simple as striking a match. It meant friction, flint, and curses, and usually involved someone's frozen fingers and the sacrifice of your last decent kindling. Vikings were clever, though. They often banked the fire at night, covering the coals with ash to keep them smoldering until morning. A well-banked hearth could mean the difference between still alive and Frode's eyebrows are covered in icicles again. So what did warmth feel like in a Viking house? Uneven, mostly. The closer to the fire you were, the better. Sit too far, and you might as well be outside. Sit too close, and you'd wake up crispy. Heat didn't exactly circulate. It drifted lazily through the smoke, hung out near the ceiling, and abandoned the floor entirely. Feet were always cold. If you think your socks aren't cutting it, imagine wrapping your feet in animal fat and hoping for the best. That's not a metaphor. Vikings sometimes smeared fat or grease on their skin for insulation, which is both practical and horrifying if you're a vegetarian. What about the floor? Most Viking longhouses had packed earth floors, sometimes covered in straw, rushes, or whatever plant material was handy. This layer served 2 purposes: insulation and absorbency. Over time, as layers of straw, food scraps, and animal droppings built up, You got a lovely organic carpet that squished underfoot and possibly walked away on its own. Floors were rarely cleaned. Instead, fresh material was simply laid on top of the old, like geological sediment made of grime. But hey, it kept your feet off the frozen dirt, and that's what passed for comfort. Lighting in winter was a struggle. With the sun barely scraping the horizon for a few hours a day, longhouses relied on firelight, oil lamps, and the occasional torch. Oil lamps were usually made from simple clay or carved stone, filled with fish or seal oil, and a wick of twisted moss or fabric. They worked. They smelled. They were one spilled elbow away from setting your cow on fire, but they let you see your hands, which was frankly a luxury. Despite the brutal conditions, the Viking home was also a place of ritual and culture. Families told stories around the fire, reciting sagas passed down for generations. Children learned survival skills, mythology, and the occasional inappropriate joke from an uncle who drank too much mead. The smoke, the smell, the clutter, these things were uncomfortable, yes. But they were also familiar, intimate, shared, and that, more than anything, is what made it survivable. If you were waiting for a magical Viking invention to tie it all together, some brilliant innovation that made the longhouse cozy, you'll be waiting a long time. The truth is, Viking homes weren't comfortable. They were tenacious. They were scrappy. They were good enough. And that's the point. Survival wasn't about luxury. It was about persistence, community, and an extremely high tolerance for livestock-induced allergies. So the next time you complain about your heating bill or the draft in your 80-year-old windows, spare a thought for the Vikings. They lived in smoke-filled barns with frozen feet and thawed fish dinners. And still somehow, they made it through. Because in the end, the Viking longhouse didn't just keep out the cold, it kept people together. Which, when the wind howls and the nights stretch endlessly into darkness, is really the only warmth that matters. There are two kinds of people in this world, those who take fire for granted, and those who have stared into the abyss of a Viking winter with nothing but a sputtering ember and a prayer. The former turn a thermostat and complain when it clicks too loudly. The latter, well, they knew that if the fire died, they might join it. The hearth in a Viking longhouse wasn't just a place to cook stew or warm your fingers. It was the axis on which survival turned, the flickering heartbeat of the home. Let it falter, and you weren't just cold, you were in serious danger of becoming a very quiet, cautionary tale. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant food. Fire meant light, smoke, company, even something vaguely resembling comfort. And so the rule was simple: don't let it go out. Ever. Now, that sounds easy enough until you realize that your fireplace is essentially a pit dug into a dirt floor, surrounded by dry rushes, wooden beams, and assorted flammable livestock. No chimney, of course, just a ceiling that vaguely encouraged the smoke to leave, or at least settle politely above head height. Most of it didn't. Viking interiors were so smoke-filled they doubled as rudimentary lung seasoning devices. But you didn't complain, because smoke meant the fire was still going, and that meant you still had a shot at not freezing to death before breakfast. Keeping the hearth alive was an art form that danced between ritual and sheer paranoia. Each night, as the house finally quieted and people lay down on beds of straw, furs, or whatever passed for bedding that year, someone had to bank the fire. This didn't mean taking it to the nearest Norse investment office and requesting a modest return. It meant covering the glowing embers with ash to keep them alive, insulated, and ready to reignite the next day. Done right, you had a cozy bed of coals in the morning. Done wrong, you had cold ashes, frozen bread, and a very bad mood. Ash, it turned out, was a natural insulator. It choked out oxygen just enough to stop the embers from burning up entirely, but not so much that they died. It was like tucking the fire in for a long napone that, if interrupted, could result in coughing, frostbite, or the collective wrath of everyone else in the longhouse who'd just lost their only heat source. If you were the one who banked the fire badly, Let's just say your popularity took a nosedive, and not even the goat wanted to sit near you. The Vikings didn't have matches, obviously. Flint and steel were the go-to fire-starting tools, but they weren't the kind of thing you wanted to deal with bleary-eyed at 4 a.m. With the wind howling and your fingers numb, sparking a fire from scratch took time, patience, and a decent amount of swearing. So they guarded those coals like they were sacred, which, in a very real way, they were. And that's not just poetic license. The fire was spiritual as much as practical. In Norse mythology, hearthfire was a gift from the gods, something bestowed upon humankind as both blessing and test. It was Freya and Freya's domain, the flickering presence of divine order in a world of chaos and cold. Letting it die wasn't just lazy, it was sacrilege. In fact, in some households, it was customary to whisper a prayer before covering the coals. Others would leave small offerings nearby, bits of bread, herbs, or bonies, if to say, "Please, O great and noble fire, do us a solid and stay alive until dawn." And if that sounds dramatic, remember, this wasn't about mood lighting. This was about not turning into a Nordic ice sculpture. Fuel, of course, was another matter. You couldn't burn wishes. Wood had to be chopped, hauled, dried, and hoarded like treasure. In treeless areas, which surprisingly existed even in Scandinavia, people burned piata thick, spongy moss, cut from bogs and left to dry. Peat burns slow and steady, but it smells like a wet forest dying in slow motion. Still, when it's peat or perish, you choose peat. Other materials found their way into the fire too: dung, driftwood, bone, and anything else that could ignite without poisoning the entire household, or sometimes even if it did. Vikings weren't picky, they were pragmatic. If it caught fire and didn't explode, it went in. The fire wasn't just for warmth either. It cooked the food, dried the clothes, boiled the water, and smoked the meat. It lit the room during the endless dark of Nordic winters, where the sun made only brief, contractual appearances. It dried herbs hung from beams, warmed newborns wrapped in furs, and offered a modest glow for carving, mending, or just sitting in exhausted silence. It was, in many ways, the most important member of the household. But the fire was also a threat. A stray spark in a dry longhouse could mean catastrophe. Viking homes were flammable by design: timber frames, straw roofs, cloth drapings, rush, stuffed bedding. Keeping the fire alive meant keeping it controlled, contained. There were no extinguishers, no fire departments, and not a drop of insurance to be found. One bad flare-up, and you were sleeping under a snowbank, cursing the gods and the goat. So firekeeping was constant vigilance. Someone was always tending the coals, feeding the flames, adjusting the pots. Children learned early not to play too close. Older folks watched for stray embers like they were watching for raiders, and everyone understood, without that fire, everything else unraveled. Even lighting a second fire, say, for a bathhouse or a forge, was a calculated risk. Those were carefully isolated, monitored, and placed far enough away from the main longhouse that if they went up in flames, at least dinner would still be edible. Maybe. The point is, fire was never background. It was front and center, loud and insistent, and every Viking knew it. If you ever wondered what really separated a successful Viking household from a failed one, it wasn't just weapons, or livestock, or treasure. It was heat. Could they stay warm through the dark? Could they keep the fire burning without wasting fuel, without setting the roof alight, without burning through their last nerve? Because winter didn't care about your intentions. It didn't care how heroic your ancestors were, or how sharp your axe looked propped by the door. Winter was relentless, and it came with one demand: keep the fire burning. And somehow, they did. Night after night, year after year, surrounded by darkness, they fed their humble hearths. They adjusted the logs, banked the coals, whispered the prayers, stirred the pots. They lived and died by flame, And from that flame came not just survival, but memory, myth, and legacy. In a world where ice tried to kill you and darkness lasted for months, fire wasn't just a necessity, it was proof you were still alive. So the next time you light a match or complain about your gas bill, remember, there was a time when people stared down blizzards, armed with nothing but an ember and a will to live. And if the fire ever died, it wasn't just the cold they feared, it was the silence that followed. If you've ever complained that your winter jacket makes you look like a lumpy burrito, consider the fashion options available to the average Viking. Layers of sheep hair, stitched animal parts, and a scent that suggested you lost a fight with a musky forest. In the grand parade of historical winter fashion, Vikings weren't strutting down runways, they were just trying not to freeze to death. And while their wardrobes wouldn't win points for style or subtlety, they were brutally efficient. You don't survive a Scandinavian winter by being fashionable. You survive it by resembling a very determined mammal. The first rule of Viking winter clothing? Forget comfort. That was a luxury for people who lived in places with sunlight and fireplaces that didn't smoke you like jerky. Viking garments were about insulation, durability, and the ability to shed water, wind, and unwanted guests. They wore what worked, and what worked was wool, lots of it. Layers upon scratchy layers of it. Viking wool wasn't your soft cashmere blend with a whimsical name. It was dense, coarse, and aggressively textured like wearing a hedge. Wool had one magical property. It kept insulating even when wet. That might not sound revolutionary until you remember that Vikings lived in a world where rain fell sideways and snow had opinions. Wool was heavy, itchy, and smelled like wet sheep when damp, which, let's be honest, was most of the time. But it was warm. It could save your life. It could also make you smell like you spent the night spooning a compost bin. But in Viking culture, that was basically a compliment. On top of the wool came the furs. Viking outerwear was a full-on collaboration between humans and the animal kingdom. Deer, elk, bear, fox, seal if it had fur and could be hunted. It had a decent shot at being turned into someone's winter wardrobe. Reindeer hides were especially prized. Lightweight, insulating, and big enough to cover a grown man, they were the prehistoric equivalent of a down parka, except instead of branding, they came with knife holes and a lingering sense of antler-related vengeance. Vikings tailored their clothes, not with precision, but with rugged necessity. Seams weren't elegant, they were functional. Cloaks were fastened with brooches or pins more than decorative. These acted as wearable Swiss Army tools. You needed to secure your cloak, wrap a wound, or hold up a makeshift tent. That brooch had you covered. Trousers were wool, often layered. Undergarments were linen, if you could afford it, or a more wool. Viking underwear was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. The idea of breathable fabric was still a few centuries and one industrial revolution away. And let's address the smell, because it would be dishonest not to. Vikings stank. They bathed more than many of their contemporary sunts a week. If the ice was cooperating, but winter bathing was rare, unpleasant, and often discouraged by local streams turning into solid objects. So clothing, once donned, stayed donned. You slept in it, worked in it, sweated in it, and, if you were lucky, lived to pass it on to your son. Some garments were worn until they disintegrated or developed ecosystems of their own. Clothing wasn't just layered, it was interlocked. An inner tunic, an outer tunic, a cloak, trousers, leg wraps, mittens, hats, each part, designed to trap precious body heat. And since insulation mattered more than aesthetics, Vikings were often wrapped so tightly they waddled rather than walked. Children resembled overdressed turnips. Adults moved like cautious barrels. But they were warm, and in Viking winter, that counted as a win. Leg wraps, or whiningas, deserve special mention. These were strips of cloth wound around the lower legs and tied off to provide extra warmth and support. They also kept snow out of boots and pants from flapping in the wind. Stylish? No. Useful? Absolutely. And in a culture where your thighs might be the warmest part of your body, any edge counted. Boots were made from leather or hide, lined with fur, and stuffed with straw or moss if you were desperate. Soles were thick, stitched from layers, and occasionally repaired with bits of bone or antler. Viking feet rarely enjoyed dry days. Instead, they settled for less wet than yesterday. Socks, when worn, were usually wool and often more whole than hosiery. Hats were essential. Heat escapes fastest through the head, and the Vikings had no intention of donating body warmth to the wind gods. Fur-lined caps, woolen hoods, and wrapped scarves helped trap heat and protect ears from turning black and falling off, a genuine occupational hazard. If you saw a Viking without a hat in midwinter, they were either drunk, dying, or had just misplaced their common sense. Gloves and mittens, too, were part of the standard winter kit. Gloves were sometimes fingerless for utility, while mittens provided superior warmth. Some were made with separate thumb compartments, giving wearers a rudimentary grip. Vikings used everything leather, fur, felted wool. Hand sewing a pair of mittens wasn't quick, but then again, frostbite wasn't exactly subtle either. Color, for what it's worth, wasn't out of the question. Viking dyes were made from local plants, minerals, and roots. Earth tones were common: browns, greys, dull reds, muted yellows. Vibrant blue or green, possible but rare. If you saw someone in bright red in December, it likely meant two things. One, they were wealthy, and two, they were about to be very visible to a hungry bear. Wealthier Vikings had more variety, of course: finer fabrics, softer hides, even imported silk if they were particularly connected or had looted creatively during a raid. But even for the rich, form followed function. Winter clothing had one job: keep the person inside it alive. Any additional benefit, social status, intimidation, accidental elegance, were bonuses. Maintenance was part of the process. Vikings repaired their clothes constantly. A well-darned tunic might have 10 different patches in 5 shades of brown, each with a story. Needles were bone or bronze. Thread was linen, wool, or gut. Men and women both sewed. Children learned early. Everyone understood that mending a hole today meant surviving the storm tomorrow. There's something darkly admirable about Viking winter wear. It was honest, brutal, but honest. No pretense, no excess. Just layers of rough-hewn practicality designed to push back the cold with a mix of defiance and damp stubbornness. You didn't wear what you liked, you wore what worked. And if it didn't work, you didn't get a second chance. Modern people often romanticize Vikings as swaggering warriors in pristine pelts and flawless braids. The reality was messier. They were swaddled, smelly, often slightly damp survivalists, wrapped in whatever kept their teeth from chattering. Their clothes were heavy, hot, uncomfortable, and essential. So the next time your scarf itches or your boots get slushy, remember the Viking trudging through waist-deep snow, wearing half a sheep and 3 weeks of sweat. They weren't dressing to impress. They were dressing to endure. And endure they did, one wool-wrapped, reindeer-cloaked, frostbitten day at a time. There are winter days where your biggest concern is whether your coffee will cool too fast. Then there are Viking winter days where the real issue is whether your axe has frozen to your hand. It's the kind of weather that doesn't just sting your cheeks or numb your fingers, it actively tries to kill you. And yet, the Vikings didn't stay indoors knitting by the hearth, though some of them probably knew how. They worked, they hunted, they raided, and they did it in conditions that would send most of us scrambling for a heated blanket and an excuse to cancel everything. Vikings didn't stop because it snowed. Snow was a given. Ice? Also a given. Wind that could peel the bark off a tree and slap you in the soul? Still not a deal breaker. Life didn't pause for weather. In the north it barreled ahead, with icicles hanging from its beard. Let's start with daily labor. Farming was obviously seasonal, because even the hardiest turnip refuses to grow out of permafrost. But winter wasn't a vacation. Vikings had chores, repairs, animal care, woodworking, metalwork, and a general assortment of back-breaking tasks that didn't care how low the temperature dropped. If your roof was caving under snow, or your barn door froze shut, you fixed it. If your sheep were stuck in a drift, you didn't wait for a thaw. You marched out with a shovel, a rope, and whatever limb-numbing resolve the gods gave you that day. Tools had to be used carefully in winter, because cold metal has a nasty habit of becoming brittle. Axes, knives, and saws were sometimes warmed near the fire before being taken out, just to prevent them from cracking on the first swing. And then there was the joy of holding a metal tool with bare skin when it's 30 below. If you've never fused your hand to a steel blade by accident, consider keeping it that way. Gloves helped, if you had them. Otherwise, you learned to move fast and swear creatively. And it wasn't just tools. Weapons, too, had their own seasonal temperaments. Iron swords and axe heads were tough, but cold made them riskier to use. A weapon snapping mid-swing was not only annoying but potentially fatal. Shields became sluggish with moisture, leather straps stiffened, bows, made of wood and sinew, required careful handling. A frozen bowstring could snap in your face like the gods telling you to stay home, but home wasn't always an option. Raiding season traditionally peaked in warmer months, mostly because rowing across oceans in ice water was about as fun as you'd imagine. But not every skirmish followed the calendar. Some fights found you in winter, whether you liked it or not. Territorial disputes didn't hibernate. Rival chieftains didn't always wait for spring. And occasionally, you needed to remind a neighbor whose turn it was to share the fjord. So yes, Vikings fought in the cold. Not always by choice, but certainly by necessity. Picture this. You're standing on a frozen hill, wrapped in enough wool to smother a bear, gripping a frosted axe, and facing down another equally miserable group of men who also just wanted to go home and sit by the fire. You're not just battling them, you're battling the temperature, the wind, and the persistent threat that your toes may snap off like dry twigs. Armor in winter was a gamble. The classic chainmail shirt offered decent protection, but also had the unfortunate side effect of becoming an icy corset if left out too long. Once moisture crept in, and it always did, it froze, turning your torso into a medieval freezer bag. Leather armor fared better in the cold, assuming it was well maintained. But all armor grew heavier with snow and ice. You didn't just march into battle, you crunched. Movement itself became treacherous. Snow concealed holes, rocks, and the occasional inconvenient cliff. Icy terrain turned sword fights into slapstick routines, with warriors slipping, skidding, and occasionally spearing the ground more often than their enemies. Stamina dropped fast. One misstep could land you on your back, staring at a sky full of snowflakes and regret. But the Vikings were nothing if not stubborn. They adapted. Cloaks were pinned tighter. Boots were reinforced with straw. Warriors kept moving to stay warm. They learned to fight fast, decisively, and often close to home. A quick ambush in familiar woods was worth more than a prolonged battle on an open field where the only victor was hypothermia. Hunting in winter was no picnic either. Tracks were easier to follow in the snow, but prey was scarcer and leaner. Animals had wised up, they moved less, traveled further, and were much better at not dying conveniently. Hunters had to work harder, wait longer, and risk more. A long trek through the forest could mean success or frostbite, and bringing down a boar in winter didn't just mean meat on the table. It meant dragging that meat back across ice and snow while hoping no wolves were watching. Fishing, while technically an option, was a test of patience and circulation. Ice had to be broken, holes drilled, and nets dropped, all while keeping your fingers intact and your boat from freezing to the lake. Saltwater fishing from longboats was possible, but again, not preferred. If your boat capsized in winter, it wasn't a question of swimming, it was a countdown. Winter work required creativity. Cutting timber? You did it in snowshoes. Swinging an axe that might or might not agree with your fingers. Tending to livestock? You braved the barn, dealt with frozen troughs, and tried not to lose your temper when a sheep kicked snow in your face. Everything took longer. Everything fought back, but the work had to be done. Even indoor tasks came with challenges. Carving, weaving, blacksmithing, these all required dexterity, which winter happily stole. Numb fingers dropped needles, cold eyes strained to see. Forge fires had to be kept hot enough to bend iron, but not so hot that they set the whole longhouse on fire. And always, always, you were aware that outside, the world was waiting to snap at you with icy teeth. Still, they endured. They didn't have a choice. You couldn't skip a season. You couldn't wait for comfort. You kept chopping, hammering, fishing, fighting not because it was pleasant, but because it was necessary. And in that necessity, the Vikings built not just a reputation, but a resilience. So when we picture the Viking helmeted, axe-wielding, beard rhymed with frost, we're not just seeing a warrior, we're seeing a worker, a survivor, someone who stepped into the cold every day and wrestled it back an inch at a time. Because in the Norse world, the cold didn't kill you all at once. It wore you down. It asked, every single day, are you strong enough to come back out here again tomorrow? And the Vikings answered by lacing up their boots, grabbing an axe, and getting on with it. Not because they liked it, but because the alternative was freezing in place while life moved on without you. There is a unique kind of hunger that comes from standing knee-deep in snow while the wind casually insults your ancestors. It's not just the kind of hunger that makes you dream of stew, it's the kind that makes you eye your boots and wonder how many hours of boiling they'd need before they became soup. Winter in the Viking world wasn't about cravings. It was about survival, and the menu was less farm to table and more whatevers, not frozen, solid. The first rule of winter eating in the north: you eat what you saved, and if you didn't save enough, you get creative. Viking winters were a test of preparation. The harvest season was a frantic, dirty scramble to fill every barrel, jar, and stomach with anything that could be preserved. And the preservation techniques? Equal parts brilliant and mildly terrifying. Salting was the go-to method for meats and fish. Salt doesn't grow on trees, but thankfully, Vikings had access to coastal trade routes and salt-rich marshes. Meat would be cut into slabs, packed in layers of salt, and left to ponder its new life as a long-term guest in a barrel. The result was a protein source that could last through months of cold, dark days. You didn't mind that it was now roughly the texture of seasoned leather. Smoking was another favorite. Vikings built smokehouses or used smoke-heavy corners of their homes to slow-cook meats over low fires. It added flavor, kept pests away, and filled your clothes with the scent of hardwood and herring, which, to be fair, might explain why nobody was in a hurry to cuddle. Then there was fermenting. This was where things got inventive. Cabbage, fish, dairy, and various root vegetables were all subjected to the Viking version of culinary alchemy. Fermentation turned perishables into survival foods, things that wouldn't kill you immediately and might even taste good, depending on how generous your palate was. Fermented shark, known as hakal in later Icelandic cuisine, is infamous. It smells like a crime scene, but was technically edible, which was often the bar Vikings aimed for. Grain was another precious commodity. Barley and rye were turned into bread, porridge, and beer. Viking beer was more than a drink. It was a caloric lifesaver, a morale booster, and an efficient way to make winter marginally less unbearable. It wasn't exactly hoppy or refined, but it did the job. And considering water quality in winter often involved ice, mud, and disappointment, beer was frequently the safer option. Milk, when it was available, didn't last long unless it was transformed into cheese, curds, or something disturbingly close to yogurt. Cows didn't produce much in winter, so dairy was carefully rationed or preserved. Butter, if it survived the fall, was stored in cool cellars and scraped like gold. Winter meals were usually one-pot affairs. Picture a large cauldron hanging above the hearth, filled with whatever combination of meat, grains, root vegetables, and fermented odds and ends happened to be on hand. Think of it as a stew with commitment issues. The pot rarely emptied, it just evolved. Additions came daily. Some ingredients dissolved entirely, replaced by new ones, until no one quite remembered where the original recipe began. And then, in the middle of all this frugality and salted despair, came Yule. Yule was the Viking winter festival, and it was the closest thing they had to a blowout. Taking place around the winter solstice, Yule was a multi-day event filled with rituals, sacrifices, toasts, and most importantly, food, real food, fresh food, or at least as fresh as anything could be in the middle of December. Animals were slaughtered often, the ones that wouldn't survive the winter anyway. Cattle, pigs, goats. Their meat was cooked over open flames, seared on hot stones, or boiled in iron pots. There was blood sausage, roasted joints, crispy fat, and enough organ meat to challenge even the most carnivorous sensibilities. It wasn't just a feast. It was a defiance of scarcity, a loud, greasy declaration that they were still here. Bread was baked in communal ovens, beer flowed freely, and yes, there were vegetables, dried peas, stored cabbages, and even the occasional onion made an appearance, sometimes for nutrition, sometimes just for the novelty of not being meat. But Yule was also about guests, and not all of them were visible. The Vikings believed that spirits of ancestors, gods, and other less definable forces roamed freely during the darkest days of the year. Food was left out for them. Special toasts were made to Odin, to Thor, to Freya. Some families even saved a seat at the table for those who'd passed on, just in case they decided to stop by. There was storytelling, singing, and probably a few questionable drinking contests. Bones were tossed into the fire. Good fortune was wished for. The feast wasn't just about indulgence, it was a ritual of hope, a moment where the long shadow of winter was pushed back by the firelight of community. But after the last toast, after the final scrap of meat was gnawed clean, reality returned. The salted fish reappeared. The barley porridge resumed its reign. And the cauldron continued to bubble, absorbing whatever edible thing you were brave enough to throw into it. If you think your pantry is understocked, remember that Viking pantries weren't closets. They were barrels, pits, and cellars dug into frozen ground. Spoilage was constant. Rodents were enthusiastic. And every mouthful of food in February was something someone had thought to prepare in August. Children learned early that waste was not an option. Bones were boiled for broth, then carved into tools or ornaments. Bread crusts were softened in soup. The line between food and utensil was often philosophical. Eating was survival, but it was also identity. The foods a Viking family managed to preserve, the dishes they passed down, the odd fermented thing they loved, despite its odor, these were cultural markers, even badges of pride. You ate what your ancestors ate, not just because it was there, but because it connected you to the past in a way that no amount of frost could erode. And if your dinner tasted a bit off, well, so did everyone else's. That's just what winter did. It made food strange, it made hunger sharp, and it made every rare feast feel like a miracle. The Viking winter diet wasn't glamorous. It was functional, flavorful when it could be, and full of hard-won calories. It relied on salt, smoke, frost, and fermentation, the four horsemen of the Norse culinary apocalypse. But it worked. And in a world where the cold crept through walls and the sun barely rose, that was enough. So the next time your fridge is low or your soup tastes weird, consider the Viking at the hearth, stirring a pot that's older than your apartment, eating something salted in September, and praying it doesn't fight back. Because surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was about staying fed. And in the Viking world, that meant turning preservation into an art form, and every meal into a quiet victory over the cold. There's a certain romantic idea people have about Viking sleep. Maybe it involves a lone warrior stretched out in front of a roaring fire, fur cloak draped casually over his massive frame, dreaming of conquest, while wolves howl in the distance. Reality, however, was a little less cinematic and a lot more crowded, itchy, and pungent. Sleeping in a Viking longhouse wasn't so much a peaceful retreat as it was an exercise in strategic body placement, pest management, and a high tolerance for other people's snoring. Let's set the scene. It's winter in a Norse village. Outside, the world is frozen solid. Inside, the longhouse is dim, smoky, and packed like a human and livestock casserole. The fire in the center glows low. The air hangs thick with the smell of sweat, wood smoke, old fish, and wet wool, and the floor is a mix of packed earth, straw, and mystery. Now try to sleep. Beds, in the modern sense, didn't exist for most people. A few lucky souls, typically the head of the household or someone with influence and a robust backstory, might have a wooden frame raised off the ground, covered with straw or wool-filled sacks and topped with animal skins. For everyone else, bedtime meant claiming a piece of floor or bench, spreading out whatever blanket, cloak, or flattened hay pile you called your own, and hoping your cousin's elbow didn't end up in your ear by morning. Communal sleeping wasn't just common, it was necessary. The idea of privacy in a Viking longhouse was laughable at best and irrelevant at worst. Families, extended families, visitors, infants, and animals all shared the same enclosed space. Children curled up next to parents. Elders got the spots farthest from the draft. Goats took liberties. Everyone else negotiated, bargained, or simply collapsed wherever there was a warm body to lean on. If you've ever tried to nap in a packed subway car during rush hour, you're halfway there. This wasn't random chaos, though. Viking households had rhythms. Older members knew where the cold spots were. Young kids got tucked in between adults, like squirming hot water bottles. Dogs parked themselves wherever they liked. And livestock added body heat. They also added aroma, sound, and the occasional startled midnight kick to the ribs. Blankets were made from whatever was available. Wool cloaks doubled as bed covers. Fur pelts were prized, not just for warmth, but for status. The finer the fur, the higher your odds of sleeping in both luxury and fleas. Because yes, fleas were a given. So were lice. So were a whole variety of skin-crawling houseguests that lived in the bedding, the straw, and sometimes, questionably, your beard. You didn't so much avoid them as accept them, like seasonal allergies or distant relatives. There was no changing into pajamas. Most Vikings slept in whatever they were already wearing, which made bedtime less of a ritual and more of a slow horizontal collapse. Taking off clothes at night in a freezing longhouse wasn't just unwise, it was a great way to wake up dead. So you kept your layers on, cocooned yourself in cloaks, tucked your hands into your armpits, and hoped for the best. The fire burned low overnight to conserve fuel. That meant the longhouse got colder as the hours wore on. Breath steamed in the dark, ice formed on the inside of walls. And if someone happened to roll away from the warm cluster of humanity during the night, they usually woke up with frost, stiffening their hair, and an urgent desire to relocate. Body heat was the real MVP. Vikings understood thermal efficiency in the most direct way possible. They became their own insulation. Group sleeping was a tactical decision. The closer you were to others, the warmer you stayed. It wasn't about affection. It was about not losing toes. And it introduced a nightly negotiation of who slept beside whom, how much space was reasonable, and what to do when someone hogged the fur. Of course, the ideal placement was in the middle of the group, surrounded on all sides by warmth. The edges? That was the danger zone. Cold air seeped in through gaps in the wall, under the door, between floorboards. The unlucky souls on the perimeter became the sacrificial thermal barrier, freezing quietly while the center slept snugly through the night. In this system, rank often helped. Being the chieftain had perks. Being the third cousin of the goat herder did not. Nighttime wasn't completely restful. There were sounds. Snoring, shuffling, livestock noises, children murmuring, old joints cracking, the occasional cough that made everyone momentarily wonder if it was something worse. The fire hissed and crackled. Wind howled outside. Snow thudded off the roof. And now and then, someone had to get up to tend the embers, check on an animal, or respond to whatever unknown thump just echoed from the back of the house. Dreaming in this setting was possible, but it probably involved fewer magical landscapes and more mental calculations about who would be least annoyed if you nudged them over a few inches. Vikings believed in dreams, omens, and the messages of the gods, but it's hard to interpret prophetic visions when a chicken has chosen your face as its sleeping perch. And still, they did it, every night, for years. This wasn't a camping trip or a temporary inconvenience. This was life. People grew up, grew old, and died in these longhouses, under these firs, amid this close-knit chaos. Babies were born beside the fire. Elders passed on quietly, in the same straw beds, where they'd once huddled as children. The communal bed wasn't just a physical space. It was a reflection of Viking life. Rugged, intimate, resilient. It taught endurance. It taught cooperation. It reminded everyone, daily, that survival was a shared responsibility. You might not like the person next to you, but their body heat mattered, and yours did too. So the next time you stretch out on a memory foam mattress, alone in a climate-controlled room, annoyed by the hum of your mini-fridge, take a moment. Remember the Norseman curled up on a straw mat, nose to snout with a pig, grateful for the warmth, and too tired to care about the smell. Because comfort wasn't the goal. Getting through the night was. When the sun vanishes for days on end, and the wind sounds like it's trying to claw its way through the walls, even the most rational mind starts to feel watched. The Vikings, practical though they were, understood this perfectly. They didn't need science to tell them winter was dangerous. They could feel it in their bones, hear it in the cracking ice, and see it in the long shadows that moved just a bit too deliberately. So they told stories. They created gods, monsters, spirits, and signs not just to explain the world, but to endure it. And in winter, those beliefs were less abstract theology and more survival strategy. You can scoff at superstition all you want, but when it's the middle of January in the far north, and your only light comes from a sputtering tallow lamp and the occasional flash of northern lights, you're not asking, is this logical? You're asking, what was that noise? And am I about to be eaten by something with horns and a grudge? The Norse pantheon wasn't a collection of kindly sky parents. It was a brutal, complex soap opera of beings who were just as flawed, vengeful, and paranoid as their mortal followers. Odin, the Allfather, was a one-eyed god of war, wisdom, and occasionally being extremely unhelpful in a cryptic sort of way. He didn't promise warmth. He promised knowledge, but usually at a cost. And in the deep of winter, when crops were dead, livestock were thin, and people huddled close for heat and hope, Odin's presence was not always reassuring. Winter was when the line between the world of the living and the world of the dead got blurry. The Vikings believed that spirits walked during the darkest time of the year, slipping through cracks in reality as easily as cold air through the seams in a longhouse wall. These weren't Casper-style ghosts offering friendly advice. They were Draugr restless dead with swollen bodies and an appetite for destruction. If you buried someone wrong, forgot an offering, or just lived near the wrong burial mound, you might find yourself dealing with one. There were also trolls, who preferred caves, but didn't mind a snowy road trip now and then, and land spirits known as landvartir, who kept an eye on how you treated their territory. Offend one, and you might find your hunting mysteriously unsuccessful, or your roof mysteriously caved in. And then there were frost giants, the Jotnar, not literal walking glaciers, though some interpretations came close, but elemental forces of chaos, cold, and antagonism. To the Norse, these beings weren't just plot devices in myths, they were metaphors with muscles. Winter wasn't just weather, it was an adversary. It had names, personalities, and it could kill you. To navigate this metaphysical minefield, Vikings developed rituals. They carved runes, offered sacrifices, and spoke charms to ward off whatever lurked in the dark. Sacrifices ranged from small bowls of food left for the spirits to the rather grim midwinter blots, in which animals and, occasionally people, though let's not dwell too long on that, were offered up to the gods. Blood was smeared on altars, bones were burned, and mead was passed around with solemn toasts and nervous glances. The Yule season, predating modern Christmas by centuries, was both celebration and spiritual armor. Fires were kept burning not just for warmth, but to hold back the night. The Yule log wasn't just decorative, it was a sacred act of defiance. Wreaths, pine branches, and evergreen decorations symbolized life clinging on in the dead of winter. And of course, feasting wasn't just about gluttony, it was about ritual. You ate and drank, not just for joy, but for protection, for strength, for the favor of beings who might otherwise forget your name. Oaths were made during Yule, serious ones, promises to family, to gods, to fate itself, and breaking them was not recommended. Not in a culture where words had weight and a broken vow could bring more than shame, it could bring consequences, the kind that came with axes, exile, or worse, ill fortune. Dreams took on special meaning during the long nights. With little daylight and much time indoors, dreams were scrutinized, retold, and interpreted like messages from the beyond. A dream of wolves might mean an enemy. A dream of falling snow might signal a coming change. And a dream that came too often was a thing to be feared. Repetition was not comforting. It was portentous. Runes were another tool, carved into wood, bone, or stone. They weren't just letters. They were symbols with power. People carried them for luck, protection, or clarity. The rune alges, shaped like a trident or upraised arms, was often associated with defense. It might be scratched into a doorway or worn on a pendant. Was it magic? Was it psychology? Did it matter? In a world where bad luck could be fatal, no one turned down a little extra help. And while it might sound grim, there was also humor in these beliefs. Dark, dry, Nordic humor, the kind that looks death in the eye and shrugs. If a house creaked in the night, someone might mutter about a troll needing a snack. If a sheep went missing, it wasn't always blamed on wolves. Sometimes it was a mischievous land spirit with a taste for mutton and mischief. This gallows humor was part of the spiritual landscape, a way to acknowledge fear without letting it rule you. The cold didn't just freeze the land. It made everything slower, quieter, more introspective. Vikings weren't constantly raging berserkers. They were people who told stories in the dark to remember who they were. They looked to the gods for meaning, not because they were naive, but because it gave shape to the chaos. When the world seems determined to kill you with every snowflake, belief is not a weakness, it's armor. So while modern winter might mean heated car seats and complaining about the thermostat war at home, Viking winter was a spiritual marathon, a season of omens, ghosts, gods, and gut-level superstition. You didn't just endure it physically, you survived it mentally, emotionally, cosmologically. Because when you live in a place where daylight becomes a memory and ice forms on the inside of your soul, belief isn't optional. It's the only thing standing between you and the darkness. It takes a special kind of madness to look at a frozen sea and think, you know what this needs? A trade expedition. But then again, the Vikings were not known for their restraint. These were people who saw a storm cloud and launched the longship anyway. Winter didn't cancel their plansit, just made the stakes higher and the bragging rights louder. To understand Viking trade in the cold months, you first have to forget everything you know about modern logistics. There were no tracking numbers, no padded shipping containers, no courteous emails notifying you that your seal pelts were delayed due to frost. Viking commerce was done the hard way, across icy rivers, through snow-choked forests, and over frozen seas that doubled as both highway and death trap. The Viking world was stitched together by trade. They weren't just raiders with commitment issues. They were merchants with ambition. Long before Scandinavian design meant clean lines and overpriced chairs, it meant saltfish, furs, walrus, ivory, iron, soapstone, amber, and enough wheeling and dealing to make even the most jaded modern economist blink. And winter, inconvenient as it was, didn't shut it down. It just changed the rules. Let's start with the sea routes. Vikings lived by the coast, and their ships were more than just tools of war. They were lifelines. The longship, with its shallow draft and elegant flexibility, was perfectly suited for hugging coastlines, threading through fjords, and sliding up rivers. In summer, it was the stuff of legend. In winter, it became an act of controlled lunacy. Frozen harbors meant that voyages had to either beat the freeze or embrace it. Some rivers and fjords would remain navigable, thanks to currents or briny seawater. Others locked up like a stubborn mule. Ice had to be broken, pushed through, or if it was solid, turned into a road. Yes, Viking traders sometimes used sleds to haul goods across frozen bays. What began as a naval expedition could end with men dragging barrels over a sheet of ice, hoping it didn't crack underfoot, and deliver them into the world's least relaxing polar plunge. And then there were the rivers, where not frozen solid, they were icy, treacherous lanes that twisted through vast forests and foreign territories. Viking traders journeyed deep into the heart of Eastern Europe via these waterways, reaching as far as Constantinople. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Never names that now appear on maps and in crossword puzzles were once arteries of a brave and bizarre trade network that didn't so much rely on infrastructure as it did on sheer willpower and well-insulated determination. Winter river travel involved careful timing. Depart too early, and you were breaking ice with your oars. Too late, and you were dragging your boat over land or watching it become one with a glacier. Portaging was common, hoisting the entire vessel and its contents overland to bypass obstacles. Add snowdrifts, frozen mud, and the occasional ambush, and you begin to get a sense of just how much these people wanted to sell you those furs. And the furs were everything: Arctic fox, bear, beaver, squirrel if it had fur and moved. It was probably a trade good. The Vikings weren't hunting for fun. They were stocking a mobile marketplace. Eastern luxury buyers, especially those in Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, were eager to get their hands on northern pelts. A good trader could return with silver, silk, spices, wine, or glass beads, exotic luxuries that added a bit of sparkle to long Nordic winters. Overland routes presented their own special horrors. Snow trails, forest paths, and icy mountain passes were traversed by foot, skis, sleds, or, if you were lucky, hardy ponies with no sense of self-preservation. Viking traders moved in caravans, usually well armed, not because they were paranoid, but because paranoia was a form of survival. Bandits, wolves, rival merchants, and weather were all competing to see who could ruin your day first. Travel was slow, cold, and uncomfortable. Frozen boots, icy beards, numb fingers handling delicate goods. Trade wasn't glamorous. It was a march of discomfort, broken only by the occasional village where one could swap goods, stories, and maybe warm up near a fire before trudging on. And yet they did it, year after year, because winter goods fetched high prices. Scarcity made everything more valuable. A shipment that made it through snow and storm was worth double. And speaking of value, the Viking traders had a knack for negotiating even in a second language while shivering uncontrollably. They traded with Slavs, Finns, Franks, Arabs, and Byzantines. They understood that commerce required not just goods, but charisma. Viking traders were storytellers, diplomats, and sometimes borderline magicians, spinning tales as they sold their wares, adding a little myth to every transaction. Even settlements adapted to the rhythm of winter trade. Coastal and riverside towns kept ice-free slips cleared if they could. Trading posts stockpiled supplies. Families prepared guest spaces for traveling merchants, who might arrive frostbitten but flush with foreign goods. Winter fairs emerged where routes converged temporary markets, where dried fish, honey, cloth, and ironwork changed hands over cups of warm ale, and a shared understanding that everything was better indoors. The coinage was inconsistent. Barter was still common, but silver was increasingly the standard. Viking hordes reveal Arabic dirhams, Byzantine coins, and locally minted currency, all jumbled together like a metallic United Nations. A trader might start his journey with a sled full of reindeer hides and return with coins minted thousands of miles away, all while never having changed socks. But not every journey ended in profit. Some ended in frostbite, shipwreck, or quiet disappearance. The line between bravery and folly was thin, and winter drew it in ice. Yet, the traders kept moving. Because trade wasn't just about economic gain. It was a statement, a refusal to be trapped. A declaration that even in the dead of winter, there was still motion, still ambition, still a spark of connection between distant, snow-covered dots on a vast and unforgiving map. So yes, Viking winter trade was insane. It was also ingenious. It took strength, skill, stubbornness, and an admirable disregard for comfort. They didn't wait for spring. They packed their goods, faced the cold, and did business anyway. Because survival wasn't just about keeping warm. Sometimes, it was about keeping the world open. It's one thing to survive a Viking winter as a grown adult with a bear pelt, a drinking horn, and a lifetime of grudges to keep you warm. It's another thing entirely when you're 3 feet tall, wrapped in scratchy wool, and trying to figure out how to hold a wooden spoon without your fingers freezing off. Childhood in the Viking Age wasn't exactly a whimsical montage of snowball fights and cuddly reindeer. It was cold, it was hard, and it started training you for adult responsibilities about 5 minutes after you could walk without falling over. To be clear, Viking childhood was not a long, protected phase of innocence. It was more like an internship for adulthood, only without pay, safety protocols, or much sympathy. Winter, in particular, was not just a season, but a test stone that could, and often did, fail you. Infant mortality was high. Cold claimed its share. So did illness, injury, and the general hazards of living in a smoke-filled room with a fire pit and livestock traffic. If a child made it past 5, congratulations were in order. Not a party, mind you, just a grim nod of acknowledgement. From a young age, Viking children were expected to contribute. Boys learned farming, hunting, and how not to accidentally shoot themselves with a bow. Girls learned cooking, weaving, and how to avoid getting trampled during goat herding. These weren't optional life skills. They were prerequisites for staying alive, and winter sharpened every lesson. Dropping a bucket of water in summer was clumsy. Dropping it in winter meant ice, injury, and someone's soup not getting made. Winter also taught patience and endurance. Children helped haul wood, gather water, and manage animals. These chores weren't about building character, they were about not freezing to death. Tasks that might be tedious in warmer months became dangerous in cold ones. Slipping on ice, getting wet, or wandering too far from the fire weren't minor mistakes. They were risk factors. The idea of play wasn't absent, but it came with an edge. Viking children played games that doubled as combat training. Wrestling, mock sword fights, throwing rocks at targets. These weren't just fun, they were preparation. Even board games like Hnefatafl, a kind of strategic battle puzzle, reflected the broader Viking emphasis on conflict and tactics. Your average game night was less about family bonding and more about outmaneuvering your future enemies. Toys existed, if you were lucky. Carved wooden animals, simple dolls, tiny sleds. But they weren't mass-produced or particularly abundant. Most were made at home, often by older siblings, or bored adults with a knife and a piece of scrap wood. If it entertained the kids and didn't end in splinters to the face, it was a win. Then there were the stories. Winter nights were long, and storytelling filled the gaps. Sagas, myths, and legends were passed down not just as entertainment, but as cultural instruction manuals. Children learned who the gods were, what happened to people who broke oaths, and why you never, ever ignore a talking animal. These tales taught values, fears, and the social do's and don'ts of Viking life. They were bedtime stories, with a body count. As children aged, rites of passage loomed. There was no universal ceremony that marked the shift from child to adult, but responsibilities increased steadily until one day, without much fanfare, you simply were an adult. For boys, that might mean sailing on a raid. For girls, managing a household or marrying into another. It happened early, often in the mid-teens, and it came with little warning beyond the general sense that if you could lift a sword or churn butter without complaint, you were ready. The harshness of winter accelerated all this. It stripped away indulgence and made everything urgent. Childhood wasn't about finding yourself. It was about proving you could pull your weight. A Viking child who complained about cold feet was gently reminded that firewood doesn't chop itself, and that sitting too close to the hearth would either roast your face or get you a swift nudge into the drafty zone. Tough love wasn't a parenting philosophy. It was the default setting. And yet, despite the difficulty, there was joy. Children laughed, played, explored, and formed bonds. They found magic in frost, wonder in the northern lights, and mischief in every unguarded moment. They learned to live with hardship, to joke about danger, and to see each scar as a story. Winter didn't crush their spirits. It tempered them. Even the youngest understood that survival was a shared responsibility. You helped where you could, learned fast, and paid attention, because winter didn't care how old you were. It came anyway, indifferent and beautiful, demanding and sublime. And if you weren't ready, you learned the hard way. So the next time a child complains that their tablet is too cold to hold, picture a Viking kid using their mittened hands to milk a goat, feed a fire, and dodge a rooster with attitude, all before breakfast. There were no snow days in the Viking Age. Only snow. There's a certain nobility we like to assign to Viking winter. We imagine roaring fires, hearty feasts, and stoic warriors staring into the blizzard like it owes them money. But behind the stories of gods and glory lies a quieter, colder truth. Sometimes, winter won. Not in a dramatic, battle-hardened clash of man versus nature, but slowly, silently, one frostbitten finger at a time. Viking life in winter was a long gamble against starvation, illness, and the simple physics of being a warm-blooded creature in a world that didn't care. It wasn't about conquering the cold. It was about surviving Itan sometimes. They didn't. Food, for one, was never a guarantee. A bad harvest meant the difference between a lean winter and a lethal one. If stores ran low too soon, meals became smaller, thinner, and increasingly creative. Bread stretched with bark, soup flavored with memories, porridge bulked up with desperation. What began as frugality slowly morphed into quiet hunger, then into brittle weakness, and eventually into absence. Starvation didn't always look like emaciated collapse. Often it came subtly. Children stopped growing, elders became listless, energy drained away until even simple tasks became monumental. The body turned on itself, metabolizing reserves, then muscle, then hope, and when the final bowl was scraped clean, silence followed. Illness was no more merciful. Winter cramped everyone together in a smoky, damp, poorly ventilated room filled with animals, fire, and optimism held together by twine. Infections spread like gossip. Respiratory issues thrived in the smoke-thick air. Wounds took longer to heal. Fevers burned without medicine. Coughs echoed through the rafters, long into the night. There were no doctors, just herbal knowledge passed down from someone's grandmother and a general agreement that garlic and moss were probably helpful. Some remedies worked, others were hopeful guesses. And when someone died, it wasn't always a tragedy. Sometimes it was just the end of a long, tired battle. Frostbite was another quiet predator. It didn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrived on the tips of toes, fingers, and small parts of the body that forgot their importance until it was too late. At first, it just hurt. Then it went numb. Then it turned black. And by the time anyone noticed, it was often a question of how much needed to be removed, not if. Vikings didn't complain. Complaining didn't fix things. If someone lost a toe, they grunted, wrapped it up, and kept moving. If someone lost more than that, they slowed down. And slowing down in winter was a dangerous thing. The world didn't wait for the injured. Sometimes, people simply disappeared. A hunter who didn't come back. A traveler who never reached the next village. A child who wandered too far. The snow took them, and the snow didn't return what it claimed. Grief had no luxury of drama. Life went on because it had to. The animals still needed feeding. The fire still needed tending. Mourning happened quietly, in glances and silence, not in ceremony. Longhouses held their dead close, sometimes literally. In deep winter, when the ground was too frozen to dig graves, bodies were wrapped and stored, waiting for a thaw. It wasn't morbid. It was practical. You can't bury someone when the earth is harder than iron. So you waited, and you hoped spring came soon. The sagas rarely mention this. They focus on the heroic, the epic, the larger than life. But behind every tale of triumph was a season of attrition. Not everyone in the story made it to the end. They weren't less brave. They were just less lucky. Or maybe the cold decided to pick them this time. It wasn't only the weak who fell. Strength didn't always win. A warrior could catch a chill just like anyone else. A mother could slip on the ice. A child could breathe too much smoke. Winter didn't care about valor. It just asked if you had enough calories, enough shelter, enough firewood, and if the answer was no, it collected its due. This wasn't defeat. Not exactly. It was acknowledgement. The Vikings didn't view death as failure. They accepted it, folded it into their worldview. Dying in winter wasn't shameful. It was a possibility, a price. If it happened, you were remembered. If it didn't, you kept going. Even burial, when possible, was shaped by winter. Ice had to be broken. Ground had to be thawed. Sometimes bodies were burned, sometimes buried in mounds, sometimes placed in boats and set adrift. Each death left a gap, and that gap was filled with memory, with story, or with quiet acceptance. We like to think of history as a series of grand events, but much of it is slow attrition. A family slowly dwindling, a fire that couldn't quite stay lit, a storeroom that emptied too fast. These were the quiet tragedies that shaped Viking life. Not battles, not gods. Hunger, cold, loss. And yet, they endured, they prepared, they fought, they shared what they had, and they buried who they couldn't save. They didn't write it down, but they remembered. Not every name made it into the sagas, but every one of them mattered. Because Viking resilience wasn't about invincibility. It was about surviving winter, even when it tried to erase you.